Tokenization is one of the biggest narratives in crypto, and it still continues to be a spotlighted big topic from all of the big players out there, including the biggest institutional players. And I do think that this is just going to continue to become a very normal thing because, tokenization is set to erupt in a much larger way in the coming weeks, months, and years ahead. I do think that really kind of focusing on some of the prominent tokenization platforms that this space has to offer right now is probably one of the best things that we can do because the ROI on those networks and on those protocols is going to be through the roof, in my opinion. So let's actually talk about this. Let's actually address 5 projects that I've actually been looking at for, this altcoin cycle for RWA tokenization. But first, let's actually start off with the tokenization narrative and why it's so strong. So recently on the 18th, Standard Chartered did say that they see new growth frontiers in non-stablecoin tokenization. Mainly what they're really kind of looking at is specific markets, private markets, and illiquid assets. This is more so, it could be commodities, it could be real estate, it could be, pretty much any major market out there could very well be touched by tokenization. We really kind of look at the capital markets in a big way because that's pretty much one of the biggest ones that are really kind of being targeted right now by tokenization, on top of course, real estate. But this is also giving us an insight that, yeah, it's starting with stablecoins, but we need to look beyond stablecoins because the next area is the new growth frontiers for tokenization, which is, of course, private markets and illiquid assets. Now, on top of this, when we actually think about the value behind, tokenization right now, it's about 24 billion. In fact, we just hit $24 billion. Most of that value is coming from private credit, US Treasury debt, commodities, institutional alternative funds, and then public equity. Now, when we think about this, right, we're starting to really see private credit go absolutely parabolic, right? I mean, if we think about it like this, let's go back to the beginning of 2024. So, about a year and a half ago. So a year and a half ago, right? This was at 8.6 billion. 6.7 billion of that was private credit. Today, we're at 24 billion plus, and private credit is at almost $14 billion, which is crazy. So it's really kind of starting in specific markets. Now, following just where the money really kind of is going and really kind of looking at, who's holding the most amount down here in terms of those asset classes, you could start to really kind of unravel what networks are being utilized the most right now around tokenization. Or just looking at the most simple view is the RWA league table, which gives us an insight on all of the most utilized networks around RWA value itself. Now, when we actually look at this, okay, we also see on the right side the latest news. And if you actually look at this, right, we have the recent article, Standard Chartered real-world asset tokenization set for major expansion. We also see some other big moves happening as well, like JP Morgan's JPMD token launch. We also see major collaboration. Deutsche Bank progresses tokenized fund work with DEMA 2. I mean, the moves that have been happening over just the last 48 hours is crazy around tokenization. This is why I say that it's going to continue to keep moving and really kind of become a much larger narrative. But if we actually look at the RWA league table on the left side, I could easily just grab, Ethereum, XLM, Aptos, Solana, and, go with Polygon as well and say, all right, well, there we go. We have 5 projects here that are very prominent names. Invest in those. No, we're actually looking beyond just this league table. We're actually looking at networks that are set for much larger RWA tokenization expansion this year. Now, with that, right, we continue to see big moves happening even with the largest players out there, like the DTCC, for example, because we do know on the 20th, the DTCC met with the SEC Crypto Task Force today to discuss tokenization. That's right, DTCC and tokenization. Hope you're paying attention. Within this, you can actually see what they were discussing, mainly utilizing tokens, blockchain, and technology standards, corporate actions, design controls, just really looking at tokenization as a whole and saying, how can we get behind this? How can we really tap in? We already know that the DTCC has been trialing tokenization for quite some time, and this is all around securities. And they move quadrillions of dollars every single year, and they have $100 trillion in assets under management alone. On top of that, just in, the OECD, world's top economic policy groups, says tokenization could transform everything from stocks to real estate. Big validation for the future of RWAs. And then, of course, we do have HSBC Hong Kong is pushing blockchain efforts in custody tokenization and bond issuance, and they expect RWA tokenization on public chains to surge in 2 to 5 years. Now, I don't think that we have to wait 2 to 5 years to actually see the value hitting these public chains, and that's exactly why I'm focused on these 5 projects. Now, what are these 5 projects that I'm actually looking at? Well, I'm mainly looking at Algorand, Plume, XDC, Sui, and Ondo. Now, I want to go through these and really kind of explain why. So let's actually first go back to the tokenization overview. And I really want to look at the networks, right? So when we look at the networks, this is what's actually on chain. This is where you can actually see a full breakdown of all of these great networks that are being utilized in a big way around tokenization. Now, obviously, Ethereum is at number 1. It's a prominent name around tokenization, around stablecoins, around DeFi, you name it. But outside of that, right, what I'm looking at is specific things. Like, for example, we look at RWA holders, right? Which, if we actually look at this, Plume has the most RWA holders, and it has surged over 38,000% in the last 30 days. Plume is becoming a giant, which is exactly why I have Plume as one of the names that I'm actually watching, because not only has the holders exploded in, overall growth, we also saw the RWA value in the last 30 days rise over 182%. And it's tapped in with some pretty prominent names out there as well. And we already know that there's a lot of connections back to a few networks that we already, are looking at around this space. So Plume is definitely up there. Now, also, you can look at the tokenized RWA asset count as well. And you can kind of go off of this and look into a few of these projects and say, all right, well, Polygon's doing pretty good at 254. It definitely is, right? But these are very common names. We already know about these projects. Why do I have Algorand up there? All right, because we only have one RWA asset count tied back to Algorand, and that's actually with Securitize. This is the Exodus movement in Class A. This is a stock, actually. It's in stocks, and it's about $285 million. Well, the reason why I have Algorand on here is because I don't think that RWA.xyz is actually tracking everything around Algorand. In fact, Algorand is already tokenizing real estate, right? And they already have a large portfolio based around that. A lot of the things around these networks are not actually being tracked. Algorand definitely has to be focused on, and I think everyone should be paying attention to some of the moves happening behind these networks that are not being tracked by these platforms, because some of them are not being updated fully through like API data, for an example. But Algorand is definitely up there. And by the way, when we really kind of think about some of these networks, they're extremely undervalued compared to where, they will be towards the end of the cycle. But on top of this, we also have to look at XDC, because XDC is number 14 on this list. Okay. And you might be saying, well, Nick, it only has $27 million tied to it. Yeah. XDC only has $27 million tied to it in tokenized value. Seems a little pathetic, right? To include this in like a top 5 RWA, tokenization video. Well, that's because XDC is adding and tokenizing $500 million in RWAs in Brazil. This is with Leaky. Now, this got announced back in April, and it has 90 days. The first issue will take place in the next 90 days with a regulated structure. That's in July. So in July, XDC is going to put its name on the board. I've mentioned this many times over. But there's already over 28 assets on XDC tokenized. This is something that I have been paying attention to because it has a mix of almost everything: commodities, US treasuries, private credit, stablecoins, and the list goes on. Now, outside of XDC, right, we also have Sui. And I do think that Sui needs to be focused on a little bit more as well, because they are working with Ondo, which we'll talk about here in a moment. But Sui is becoming an absolute giant in this space with VC backing. I do think that Sui could be a very big winner this cycle, not just because of tokenized, value tied to it, but also just the overall recognition from VCs and the focus that Sui actually does have on it right now. Now, on top of Sui, the last major one is a platform actually. And when we think about the platforms, well, we already see which one is the biggest one in terms of top net flows as of the 21st. Ondo is second. In fact, Ondo is one of the only few platforms on this list that you could actually invest into. And if we actually look at Ondo, check this out. In the last 30 days, we're up about 12% in terms of total value. Now, that might not be a lot, but it's sitting at almost $3 billion. And it already has over 15,500 plus holders. And Ondo is working with some very prominent networks out there: Ethereum, Solana, XRP, Mantle, Aptos, Arbitrum, Mantra, and even Polygon. I do think that Ondo is a blue chip in this space as well. They already have some very prominent names tied to them around major issuers. I think if we actually go over here to the issuers, so it doesn't really break it down, but Ondo is working with BlackRock and major asset management companies and institutional players as well. Ondo is building basically Wall Street 2.0, and I do think that that's something that they're going to be very successful in doing so because they already have a massive platform behind that. Ondo has to be focused on 100%, and I think everyone should add Ondo to their watch list. But I want to go over the market overall opportunity here, right? So Sui, right? Now I'm going off of the most valuable to the least valuable here, okay? And right off the rip, Sui has a crazy valuation tied to it. Fully diluted value, $27 billion. I do think that Sui could hit some significant highs. I would not write off the idea of Sui having anywhere between 5 to 10 times the value that it has tied to it today. The number one thing that we need to focus on with Sui is the token unlocks. Okay, because if we actually look, the circulating supply is 3.39 billion compared to its 10 billion supply. And over time, this is actually going to increase significantly. For an example, by the end of this year, we will be at an unlocked supply of 3.73 billion. That's not a crazy amount compared to the 3.4 billion that we're at, but we still need to be aware that it is a token that has inflationary aspects tied to it. So just make sure that you are aware of that. Obviously, I think that Sui is going to perform fine, even regarding the inflation of it. Especially with the VC backing, but also the fact that it has connections back to some very prominent names, and it is starting to move up the ranks in RWA value. Next up is Ondo, right? So Ondo has a fully diluted value of 7.38 billion. And again, yes, we still have that inflationary aspect tied to it. But I don't think that we need to worry too much about the inflation on Ondo. Because the next significant unlock isn't until about roughly January of 2026. And by that time, I do think that the market should be either, close to its top or at its top. And then the next unlock after that is January of 2027. All of the unlocks are January. They're by year as well. So I don't think that we need to worry about it too much. But everything will be fully unlocked by 2028 around Ondo. The future is very bright for Ondo in a sense that, number one, it's kind of a newly launched project, very similar to the Plume, if you will. But the difference here is that Ondo is absolutely killing the game by bridging TradFi to the tokenization space in a huge way. Ondo is also one of the only platforms in the space that has a complete 100% infrastructure built for tokenized stocks. Ondo has basically created a tokenized stock exchange. That's why Ondo is calling this Wall Street 2.0, and it's collaborating with some very prominent names in the space to actually make sure that that becomes a reality. So today's value of Ondo at 2.33 billion, or the fully diluted value of sub $8 billion, I do think that Ondo will 10x from here. I think that that's a very conservative outlook as well. I think long term Ondo will obviously be valued in the hundreds of billions of dollars because of how successful Ondo has been in networking with some of the biggest names in finance already. But also, all of the moves that they've been making is also very significant. Now, outside of Ondo, Algorand. So, Algorand has a $1.45 billion market cap tied to it. Fully diluted value, 1.68 billion. Almost all the supplies out there. I think the rest of the supply that they're actually not, really kind of looking at is locked up in staking mechanisms, and also really kind of just stored away. But with Algorand, the market opportunity today is very significant because we're back to prices that we haven't really seen since going back to 2020. Obviously, Algorand did hit an all-time low during 2022, and it did take a little bit of time for us to actually bounce back from that. I still think that Algorand is a very prominent name in the space. I think that Algorand is a blue chip still, and I think that over time people will really kind of realize that. The ecosystem around Algorand is extremely jam-packed with great value. Like I said, there's a lot of things happening around tokenization on Algorand that I think everyone should research into beyond RWA.xyz, which tells me, with this valuation, a 10x from here would be very safe. I think that it can go much, much higher than that because of how successful Algorand has been in, the tokenized real estate game, but also just in general, right? The ecosystem has been growing. They've been expanding it greatly. DeFi is becoming a big reality on Algorand as well. And, Algorand is just one of those projects that we've been focused on since going all the way back to 2020 into 2021. And since then, a lot has happened, obviously, in terms of price action, ups and downs. But one thing that is very, very common with Algorand is that they just don't stop moving, right? We've been seeing nonstop growth around the ecosystem and a lot of building happening around Algorand. So definitely focus on Algo this cycle as well. And then, of course, XDC. So, with $500 million being tokenized on XDC, if that becomes reality, we're comparing a $500 million tokenized initiative back to a market cap of almost $1 billion. That's almost 50% of the market cap of XDC. The fully diluted value is $2.24 billion, but $500 million is huge for XDC. This is one of those projects that I think is just being overlooked. Not a lot of people are actually aware of what's happening on XDC, including, of course, this $500 million deal. I think once this starts to become a reality, XDC is going to explode in value. I think it's going to be on, the radar of many individuals out there, especially once it starts to climb the ranks on RWA.xyz and headline articles are being written about XDC. Outside of XDC, though, and by the way, price action wise, I do think that XDC has a high probability of hitting 50 cents to a dollar this cycle. But outside of XDC, Plume. So Plume is trading at all-time lows. But that's because it's a fresh launch in terms of price action on CMC. Obviously, there was some price action on DEXs and stuff before that. But for the most part, price action, this is at a very significant opportunity, in my opinion. Especially considering the size of Plume. Their socials are absolutely massive. They have 1 million followers. Joined back in October of 2023, so they have been growing nonstop. They're backed by some very prominent names in terms of venture company or venture capitalist and also crypto companies. But on top of that, when we look at Plume itself, right, market cap 167 million roughly, fully diluted value 834.5 million. So yes, there's the concern about token unlocks and releases. But I want you guys to understand that with the overall amount of money tied back to Plume already, and with how much growth that we've been seeing around tokenization and also their socials, I do think that this could be one of those top, 10, top 20 projects. I want you guys to realize that to get into the top 20 right now on CoinMarketCap, you would need a market cap of $6.3 billion. We're at $167 million in market cap, which is wild. The upside potential on Plume could be very significant, especially if we do continue to see a lot of moves being made, like similar to the ones that we've been witnessing around Plume, because this type of growth, the moves that are being made here, is very, very exciting to see. I mean, just in terms of tokenized value, I mean, this has been an incredible year for Plume so far, and RWA holders, I mean, this is just an upward path. So when we look at some of these networks, I do think that we need to pay attention to them. Plume is becoming a very big player. It's actually becoming one of the most watched projects in my RWA category as well. So with that being said, definitely pay attention to Sui, Ondo, Algo, XDC, and Plume. I think that these are going to be 5 very successful projects, especially, you know, as tokenization only continues to heat up. Obviously, there's some other great opportunities in this space, like HBAR for an example, or even XRP, but I wanted to talk about, you know, 5 projects that a lot of people actually don't put a spotlight on, and that's 5 of them. And with that being said, if you guys did enjoy this video, definitely leave a like, subscribe, turn notifications on because more free content. You guys are more than welcome to follow me on Twitter and join the free Discord in the description below. And with that being said, guys, Nick, thanks for watching. Peace out.